push the button, and it will go to the next slide. Oh, yeah, that's me. Okay. There we go. All right, so I actually joined CPATH when CPATH got a grant from FDA to start the Rare Disease Clinical Outcome Assessment Consortium. And they brought me on to kind of figure out what that meant and how we were gonna do that. But FDA was very firm with us, and some of you who are in the room will remember what they really wanted at the end of this day was what they called a common resource of COAs that could be used across multiple rare diseases. So we had to really stop for a minute and figure out what would that look like. There are 7,000 plus rare diseases. How do I create one common resource for all of those tools, or all of those diseases rather? I'm pushing the big green button. Okay, there we go. So we spent about 2 years with FDA seed money kind of pondering those questions. How are we going to organize this? What are we going to build? How are we going to build it? Who should be involved? And in January of 2022, we actually launched as a separate individual independent consortium funded by member fees, which was an exciting milestone in and of itself. But really, the mission, again, was to create this pre-competitive, multi-stakeholder space where we could really think through the challenges in rare disease research and identify scientifically sound tools and methodologies for collecting the clinically meaningful outcomes data in rare disease trials. You know, just a minor, small task, small lift. So we currently have 21 member firms that include both a mix of biopharmaceutical companies, and then we have 2 patient advocacy groups, NORD and RareX Global Genes, and then we also are partnered with colleagues in Europe with the International Rare Disease Research Consortium. So that's been great to have all these different minds at the table together. And even better, we had industry co-director, my industry co-director, Dawn Phillips is here. I don't know where she is, somewhere hiding. There she is, she's in the corner, who's got a great deal of expertise in rare disease clinical trial space, kind of helping us guide where we're going. We have an official FDA liaison who's been wonderful to work with. And then we had some really fantastic clinical experts that we were able to bring in to help guide our initial efforts, who were kind of, I called them my boots on the ground. They were in the trenches doing the actual measurements in clinical trials, as well as being able to bring representatives from a number of different centers from and NIH into the mix, as well as the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And we've also had involvement from several folks from the CBER side of FDA. So we've been able to bring all of these really smart, fantastic people together in one place. So we started thinking, how are we gonna build this resource? And where are the biggest challenges? And so very quickly, the consensus came to, we're struggling the most in kids. Pediatric, non-oncologic patient populations is where we are having the most trouble coming up with good measurement strategies. And that was from both FDA and regulatory bodies and our sponsor firms coming to us and saying, we don't know what to do here. Like, let's get together and think about this. And as I mentioned, you know, with 7,000 and growing rare diseases, it was quickly obvious we couldn't go through every rare disease and say, these are the 5 best COAs you should include in all of your trials. That was not realistic and really not a good use of anyone's time. So we identified pretty quickly, the way we were gonna approach this was to use a domain approach to identify COAs that may have applicability across multiple rare diseases. And we decided to start with a couple of items that fell under daily functioning, because when we talked to families, when we talked to our sponsor firms, that's where they're really seeing, you know, the functional benefits of treatment. That's what families wanted to see, not just, you know, can my child tap their fingers so many times, but can my child do a button? Can my child hold their spoon level enough to feed themselves? Because as the mom of 3 small children, I can tell you it matters a lot to how my day goes once they hit those milestones. So we started there with self-care, gross motor function, fine motor function, and communication and language. And we really developed a strategy for how we were going to embark overall as a consortium. Obviously, the first goal was to establish and then expand this rare disease clinical outcome assessment resource, but really also wanted to focus on, we have all these experts in the room. We really want to promote collaboration and education and make sure we're learning from each other, because in the rare disease space, as it came up multiple times this morning, it's not any good if you do a clinical trial and it fails and all that information is lost. You know, we need to be sharing our learnings. We need to make sure that we're propping each other up, honestly. And so we also want to advance solutions for methodological and measurement challenges in rare disease by engaging all of these experts and making sure that we're disseminating that information, educating, and connecting with our partners in research. All right. So this is kind of the work structure of the COA, the Rare Disease COA Consortium. And as no surprise, in the center of this is really building out this resource. As I mentioned, we started with 4 subdomains of daily function. We're actually expanding now into pain and sleep disturbance and impact. And that's really the core of what we do. But again, we had all these experts in the room, so we really have tried to attack some of the methodologic challenges as well. You know, I think it's been mentioned several times, rare diseases are very heterogeneous. They have patients within patient differences, between patient differences are huge and really impact study design. So we did a literature review to really look at kind of measurement approaches that had been used to address that in clinical trial design. And we identified six methods, and then we actually linked those to FDA approvals by type, and then thought about it through the lens of how might these apply in rare disease research programs. And that publication actually came out in Value in Health earlier in this spring, and I have a link for it in the next slide. We started November of 2019, and then 2020 hit. This little thing called COVID kind of made life really difficult for all of us. And our sponsors came together and said, we are struggling. So we pulled a team together and looked across the lifespan of a clinical trial where COVID was impacting the disease, it was impacting the ability to conduct a trial, and then how people were mitigating those challenges. And we put together a really comprehensive table with all the mitigation strategies, both in clinical trial settings and in the clinic. That's all published online if you guys want to look at it still. Hopefully it's now not needed, but you know, it stuck around longer than I wanted it to. But it was a really amazing opportunity for us to show that we could be very nimble and flexible and address the needs of the community very quickly. So that, you know, that was within 6 months of the consortium addressing that this was an issue. We had a webinar pulled together. We had some actual ideas for how to mitigate these challenges and move things forward. More recently, we started an endpoint creation for gene therapy team. We were really looking and thinking through if you're how you structure a trial in gene therapy is not quite the same as when you have a drug that's going to make certain aspects of the disease better, but is not going to be, I hesitate to use the word curative, but it's not going to be disease modifying in the same ways. So we have a working group that's working on kind of best practices for that, and how, based on looking at how some of the approvals that have come out so far, what they've leveraged, and seeing if we can draw kind of some learnings from that. We also have a qualitative data collection team because, you know, as it was mentioned earlier today, certainly from the statistical side, rare disease programs are always underpowered. So, you know, qualitative data can add such rich experience data to a clinical trial setting when it's collected systematically, and really help move the needle when there are cases like Dr. Baracchio was talking about earlier today, when maybe the primary endpoint didn't didn't do what you expected it to, but if you have qualitative data that helps kind of lift support, but patients didn't just, walk a few extra feet, they actually felt more stable, they didn't feel like they fell as much. Those kinds of inputs can be difficult to quantify, but if you have rigorously collected that in a way during your clinical trial so that you can compare, say, if you've got it, placebo versus non-placebo, and see if those effects seem to play out in the qualitative data, that totality of evidence package is now way stronger than just, they moved an extra 3 meters. So we're working on actually 2 papers in that group to really help support why you should be doing qualitative research in rare disease trials, and then really more practical, like how to, because there are challenges doing qualitative data collection in rare disease trials. And then the last methodological issue here I wanted to just highlight briefly is, so NORD was in a subawardee on our original grant from FDA, and it was a fantastic opportunity for us to work with them and some of their I Am Rare registry partners. And so we did a brief survey and then followed up with some structured interviews to really get a sense from registry developers, why are you building these registries? What are you including? How are you making the decision on what to include, measure in terms of measurement? What are you measuring? How are you measuring it? And what are the pain points? Because I think it's very obvious that the patient advocacy groups and patients, when they're inputting that data, they want it to be used for something. They want it to be clinical trial ready. They'd love for it to stand as a natural history leg or, external control arm. But frequently the way the data is collected doesn't make that possible in reality. So seeing if there were places that potentially CPAP could help close that bridge. We might not be able to completely pave that road, but at least improve the quality of the data that's coming out of patient registries. Okay. So as I mentioned, this is the Value in Health publication that came out about the measurement approaches, and then we have the launch of the COA resource, which you're all here for live. Mark the day. All right, so I want to take a brief moment before I launch into showing you the resource to really just kind of take a step back and what is the resource? The Rare Disease COA resource is designed to provide information on published COAs that have the potential to be used to support efficacy endpoints in treatment trials for rare diseases, which sounds easy, but but what I want to kind of take a step back and really make sure everyone is grounded in is, so there's COAs encompass 4 types. Patient-reported outcome measures, I think, are the most commonly used, followed by, and then there's observer-reported outcomes, ClinROs, clinician-reported outcome measures, and performance outcome measures. And all of those COAs together are supposed to measure how an individual feels, functions, or survives in the setting of a clinical trial. I would say, by and large, most people immediately think of PROs when they think of COAs. 50% of rare diseases occur in pediatric populations. I promise, as the mom of 3 kids under 10, none of them can reliably report on anything, and they don't have a rare disease. When I see my daughter hit my son, and I said, "Did you just hit him?" And she says, "No." I don't know that we can include that in a clinical trial setting. Some reporter issues. So we're not looking at including PROs in pediatric populations. And I will emphasize there too, I mean, we also, I'm making light of it, but you have very young children as well who are pre-verbal that you wouldn't expect to be able to respond. So when you think of COAs in pediatric rare diseases, stop thinking about PROs. You're not going to use them in most cases. We are going to be talking about OBS-ROs, ClinROs, and performance outcomes measures because I can't ask the patient. And that's just the reality. The other thing I really want to make sure people are grounded in, this resource is not a library where, I'm going to go and select this tool, throw it in my program, and it's going to work perfectly. The FDA has issued 4 guidance documents on how that's not going to happen. And the truth is you have to understand your disease. You have to conceptualize the clinical benefit that you think your treatment is going to have on the disease. And then you have to really pick an outcome. What kind of outcome? Again, not a PRO. And so how does that, not being able to get self-report, how does that impact your ability to measure certain things like pain and sleep quality when you can't ask the patient? How are you going to do that? And then you have to decide, is there something existing, or do I have to make something new? And you still have to find support and evidence to show that the tool you're looking to use makes sense in your patient population. I don't think any of us want to have a trial where, executive functioning, yes, median age of my population is 3. I promise executive functioning is not going to move in your trial. So you really have to think through and ground what you pick in your understanding of the disease and your understanding of what your treatment is supposed to do, which are enormously challenging in rare disease, and I don't mean to make light of that, but can sometimes get lost in the message. And I just really want to make sure that people keep this in mind when they're looking at tools that are included in the resource. So we have developed a pretty robust methodology for selecting COAs that go into the resource. We have a domain and prioritization and definition step, and then we conduct a landscape analysis for COAs for the selected domains that, not just in clinical trials, what's being used in clinical care, natural history studies, across the board, to really make sure we're not missing anything. And then we kind of winnow that down based on some, honestly, common sense guidelines. Is this actually measuring what I think it's supposed to measure? And quick review quickly tells you no for a lot of things. And then we do an in-depth gap analysis where we really look at each of the tools against evidentiary standards that have been established through the 4 FDA guidance documents, through EMA guidance documents, and other regulatory bodies, and really put these tools under the gun and say, are they going to measure up? If I submit this to regulatory bodies, are they going to measure up? No tool has them at all, by the way. I have 15 years as a COA developer and never managed to hit every box. There's always something that doesn't quite fit. So that's not the expectation, and I don't think that's not, as a COA developer, I would never expect that. I don't think that's regulators' expectation, but you need to make sure that the tool you're using at least hits the minimum of, it's measuring what I think it's measuring and it's doing it reliably. And then we have a consensus process. I've been blessed in my consortium to have a number of internal experts who have worked in pharma for a long time and have seen rare disease programs through to approvals. We have a number of folks who were physical therapists in their past lives and actually implemented many of the tools that are used in rare disease trials, as well as our clinical experts, and as well as our regulatory colleagues, honestly. And we've all looked through the data and kind of picked which tools we thought should be included in the resource. And then we convened advisory panels with external occupational therapists, physical therapists, and caregiver representatives to double check our work and make sure, did we miss anything? Are there other tools we should have considered that somehow got missed? And honestly, in that process, we also gained a lot of information from the caregivers around what they did and didn't like about some of these tools. When we were looking at the gross motor function tools, many of them include aspects of ambulation, and our caregiver representative said, my daughter stopped walking 4 years ago, and every time we participate in a trial for our disease, this questionnaire is included, and it's like pouring salt in the wound for me. She was really upset, and it really bothered her. And we talked about it as a group afterwards, and it's like, this is a really amazing opportunity for us to also highlight where all of us can do better to educate each other on why we're including certain tools in our trials. Sometimes we have to include these tools. The population goes from ambulatory to non-ambulatory, and we have to capture that inflection point. But as clinical trialists, we need to make sure we're engaging with our patient communities so they understand why they're being asked a questionnaire that asks about ambulation when their kid isn't ambulatory anymore, and make that case clearer so that they're more engaged with us. And it really just struck to me like how much this really needs to be a collective effort for everybody. And so we've really tried to actually pull that contextual information into the resource and make notes of places where the caregiver said, you know, I hate this tool. We didn't put it that way, but it's like, you know, in cases where tools are included aspects like this, you might need to do some additional outreach and education to your patient advocacy partners to really make sure that they're engaged the way you want them to be. And then we've made all of this information available on this website that we've launched, and you'll have access to it all. So the tools that have been included in the resource represent tools, I'll put a few caveats on this. So they represent tools that we could find. They had to be in the published literature. I know there are tools that are being developed. Many of you are probably developing them in your individual programs, or I know there are a number of patient foundations that are creating their own COAs. But if they haven't published anything on it, we couldn't find it. But this will be an iterative process. You know, I was speaking with somebody last week, and I already know one tool that's being developed out of Duke, the Observer Reported Communication Assessment, which was originally developed for Angelman, and now has one of the core outcome grants from FDA to expand into 12 other rare diseases. Hadn't published anything, but they came and presented to the consortium so that we were aware of the tool, but it's not included in the resource yet because the publications hadn't come out. So you will see tools that we could find. And there are also cases where there's historical COAs that have been included where they don't meet many of the evidentiary standards. They've been used in the communities for so long that you have to include them. And yes, there probably needs to be some modification and some adjustments to them, but there's so much evidence based on them that they help kind of guide where we're going, and in many cases also provide the ability for us to look at them, the data against normative standards, so how your kids in your population are doing against what norms would be to help interpret your trial results. I want to emphasize, the COA resource is not a core outcome set. So a core outcome set would be you go to self-care and I give you the 3 COAs that you're going to use always in to measure self-care. That is not what this is. You guys are still going to have to really look at the tools that we've included and think back to that framework and select the tools that best fit your programs. But what we have done with this resource is I like to call it the best ofs. We've collected the best ofs. We've looked at everything that's out there and really put them through the ringer of evidentiary standards and selected the tools that are most likely to work in clinical trials for rare diseases. And then it's your job as the user of this resource to go through and look at the 10 self-care items or COAs we've identified and decide which one makes the most sense in your community. Which one is measuring things like being able to do a button or pull a zipper, and does that make sense in your community? And is that something your treatment is going to target and be able to see effect on? You're still gonna have to go through that process. But now you don't have to look at the 600 COAs that for self-care and go through all the steps to decide which ones might work in your treatment trials and your population. So the resource can reduce the time and cost it goes into deciding which COAs to include in your rare disease trials. As someone who worked for a CRO for a long time, I can tell you I made a lot of money doing these lit searches for folks. So we've done that for you for these domains that are available today. And so we really want to be able to help you select the appropriate COA for your individual research programs. And then the other thing I'd really like for this resource to do, and we'll see how this plays out, but I'm really hoping that patient advocacy groups will be able to see the COAs that we've included. Some of them are observer reported and could be easily administered in a patient registry. Some of them are not. But at least have an idea of how to best measure some of these domains in a better way that's more robust, that gives us better data out of registries. So that's maybe a longer term goal for me for the resource, but that is something I'm really hopeful about. Again, as I mentioned, right now, the first iteration of the resource includes gross motor function, fine motor function, self-care, and communication and language. And then we are expanding. We're looking at pain interference and pain severity, sleep disturbance and sleep impact, and we'll be expanding over time. So this is what it looks like if you go to the Rare Disease COA resource. For right now, Google is a little behind, in my opinion, but it's not searchable in Google. Apparently that takes a few days. But if you put in the full website, you can access the resource. And you'll see we have a number of tabs there, which COAs are in the resource, frequently asked questions, links to information, all of that is there for you. Again, you will need to put the whole the whole web address there into your browser to get it at this point, until Google catches up. And I will say as well, just this is not optimized for doing on your phone. So if you're pulling this up now on your phone, it's going to look funny. There's a lot of information, and when later on this afternoon, we're going to be doing kind of a live walkthrough of it, and you'll see, if you're looking at tables next to each other, I think we can all agree 3 inches wide, you're not going to get a lot. So we really focused for this first initial round on optimizing it for desktop. So again, you'll be able to go and do COA searches. You can search by name. If you have a specific COA that you want to know about, you can pull that up. If there are different versions of a COA, many of you are familiar with the Vineland. If you put Vineland in, you will get 5 different versions of the Vineland that you can then compare to see what are different between the 5 versions and what you might want to work with. If you don't know specifically what you want and just kind of want to take a peek around and see what COAs have been included up to this point, if you click on COAs in the resource, there's a table with all of the COAs that have been included thus far, with links. If you click on the links, it'll give you all the information from the gap analysis, which is honestly a lot of information. And all of it is available for free. So that's a big bonus. There are other databases out there that will provide some of this information, but you pay a lot of money to get access to them. So that's something that we are very happy to be able to offer. So as I mentioned, we have a showcase later this afternoon where instead of slides, I'm going to have a computer and I will just walk people through how you interact with the resource, and we'll have a chance to actually kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the resource for those of you who are interested. That's tonight, or this afternoon, 4:15 to 5 in the ballroom, E75. So I think that's actually the room next door. Okay, thank you, Laura. And then before I end, I know you can't see all of the different consortium. These are all of the rare disease efforts we have at CPATH, and I know Colin has emphasized this earlier today as well, but none of us are operating in a vacuum here. CPATH has a tremendous rare disease program, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it, and I feel like sometimes it's easy to think, oh, okay, they're doing that, those folks are doing this, but the truth is, we're all talking to each other in the background. I'm having conversations constantly with our quant med teams about data analyses that they're working on. I'm talking to D-Risk about potential COAs to include in the Duchenne world. I'm talking to CPTA about outcomes in those, that can be used in those trials. There's a lot of cross-consortium and initiative collaborations at CPATH that we really, this is a relatively new that we have so many, but I'm really excited about our opportunities here to really leverage information and having all of these people together at the same time in the same place, and kind of getting to the point where Colin had in one of his slides, where we have all the right people and at the right place at the right time to really make some big improvements in rare disease research. So I'm really delighted about that, and I hope this resource helps get us that much further. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions. you have a question? Okay.
Hi there, Jessica Bohanowicz from the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research. We are one of those organizations who have a lot of very specialized caregiver-reported outcomes, but a lot of them, although they are used in the pediatric population, they are also extended into adults as well. So I was trying to understand a little bit about, I understand that you're focusing on pediatrics right now, but are the surveys, is there like an age cap limit on the surveys that you're generally looking at, or are you looking at ones that are just pediatric but also span pediatric into young adult and adult?
So our searches generally went from, I think we had it go from 2 to 18, were kind of the general search parameters. Individual tools do sometimes go beyond that, and that wasn't an exclusion criteria for, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Ramona's got a question.
I have lots of questions, but I'll just ask one, simple one. You were talking about the inclusion of COAs that were older, that are sort of a standard care, that you had to include them. Do you have a note on your resource that says, this is an older one that we're including for standard of care? Because a naive person coming in might think, oh, look, it's in the resource. It must be one of the really great ones.
Yes, yes, there are. Okay. We do have like a comments, but yes. Short answer, yes. In a way that's as nice as possible. I didn't want to, I don't want developers coming after me with pitchforks. There are tools that are being used that, really are there just because.
Hi, Susie McCune from PPD. This is a fabulous tool and a great resource. I know that you've broken it down by, let's just take motor, but clearly infant motor, different. I haven't had a chance to get into the specific tool. Do you have that information, the specific tool, in terms of the ages that are validated for those? Okay.
Yes, and that's, again, why this is not like a click-and-go library, because because of those issues, we have tools for motor skills that go from when you're evaluating a 2-year-old to when you're evaluating an 18-year-old, and those look very, very different.
Absolutely, and even down to birth. So
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It was a great tool.
Thank you for your talk. I am curious about, because it's all based on lit review. I've worked with RDCA-RND, who is trying to line up all of the outcome measures that they've used, and what's often not in lit review is the negative data. So those COAs that have been used that they haven't measured effectively and have been abandoned, and we don't know about that. And so sort of for the future, learning from KOLs and how we can maybe implement that into the resource,
Let me see if I was having a hard time hearing you, but so COAs that didn't get included but might have worked, or COAs that don't work?
COAs that don't work for particular, say, nonverbal children, right? So we, as a good example, right, communication is hard to collect, and I've seen in RDCA-RND several examples of where during the U54 natural history study that some disorders just stopped collecting Vineland because there was no measurable change being seen in certain disorders. You may not see that reflected in the literature because it was never published because they stopped collecting it.
Right, so that's where the consensus process really became crucial, was we had the experts who have used these tools, who brought that experience and said, okay, Vineland's great unless you have a population that stops being verbal. And so that's a note on Vineland, like, there's a caveat here. It's a great tool, but not if you're not verbal. And then you might want, so we included also tools that included aspects of nonverbal communication. Again, getting back to that, you're still gonna have to select the tool that's right for your patient population. There is no magic bullet, unfortunately, but.
Thank you for the great presentation. I have 2 questions. So you mentioned recently developed COA may not be included in the data source. So I was wondering how often the resource is going to be updated?
That's to be determined. I have a 2-man team, 2-woman team, actually, to be clear. No, but we're trying to stay on top of that. And one of the tabs that we have, I don't think we released it in this iteration, is up-and-coming COAs that we are aware of that maybe haven't met that threshold, but that people should maybe want to be aware of.
Another question is, do you recommend using this data source with other like COA library or databases like eProvide?
I mean, sure, you absolutely can. The information is going to be very complementary.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh-oh, now I'm in trouble.
Well, I was just going to echo that once you select something, you should come and talk to the agency about what you've selected. I mean, I wouldn't be me if I don't say that, right? If you haven't been around me at enough conferences. Because really, this is to help folks get that jump start, right? This is a very intimidating field, a rare disease. How do I pick the right thing? And where do I start, right? So really, this is meant to help get a little jump started with some basic information that has been driven by the consensus process. Could you maybe, Lindsay, talk a little bit more about that consensus process to the folks? Because I do think that that was an integral part of those discussions that were said, because the point that was made, we would actually say, that may not be good. And there was a lot of good expertise on those conversations. So could you maybe delve a little bit more into what really, you know, this wasn't like a one time we met for a day. Like this was a very lengthy process. So I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit more about the process and the different types of disciplines that were involved.
Absolutely, yes. That's a great point, Michelle. Yes, so that consensus process really, it was a process. We had a resource development subcommittee that we formed, and we had our regulators at the table with us. We had, well, I'm gonna out Dawn. My industry co-director is also a physical therapist in a past life. We had folks who have gotten drugs approved in the rare pediatric population space. We had external clinical experts that we had brought in, so 2 neuropsychologists and a speech-language pathologist, and then COA development experts who all went through the gap analysis reports. And there were, I think for communication alone, we had 68 different COAs that we were looking at. So we went through every single one and looked at all the information and we batted it around. You know, the speech-language pathologist would say, oh, I use this all the time. And Michelle or Naomi would occasionally be like, yeah, let's not include that. Like, it's not, we've seen that, it's not working. It's great for clinical care, not so great in the clinical trial space. Or sponsors would say, yeah, used that, burned bad, don't do that. And we really had that open dialogue with each other. It was, you know, it's 10 or 12 of folks that are participating in my consortium who really sat around for months, honestly, going through all of these reports and then really thinking through, like, how were they being used and how successful had that been outside of, you know, clinical practice? How were those being used in clinical care or in clinical trial spaces? And then we checked that with external advisory panels to make sure that we were on target, and pulled in additional physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech-language pathologists, caregiver representatives to make sure that we hadn't missed something, that a tool that they thought worked really well had somehow missed the screening process. And it really ended up pretty happy with the results. So, but it was an iterative process. I think each of the advisory panels met at least 3 times. The resource development committee met every 2 weeks for, 6 or 9 months to go through the 4 domains. So it was a lengthy process with a lot of back and forth discussion.
Hi, I'm Karen Kaiser. I'm from Northwestern University. Thanks for your talk, Lindsay. It was really great. I had a question about condition-specific measures versus more general measures. So with this domain approach, were you prioritizing more general measures over condition-specific measures, and how did you handle that, given that, especially since some condition-specific measures may have less evidence supporting their validity and other things?
So I will say, I think we ended up with more generic measures overall, because there's more reported on them, but we certainly didn't exclude if there was a condition-specific tool that we looked at it and said, hey, this worked really well in this disease population, maybe it could be applied to something else, then it got included. Now, you're all coming in. All right, Dawn. I did call you out.
I just want to add that this isn't going to be like the thing that's going to answer all of your questions. You still have to go back to the roadmap and say, what are my concepts of interest and how do they map against this measure? And so it's meant just to give you a starting place to say, oh, I never thought of this one, because our discussions were so robust. And for these two people, maybe they had an incredibly positive experience with this very specific disease and this very specific age. And then somebody else had a very different experience and said, well, that had a ceiling effect for me, or I couldn't use it in this way. And so it doesn't take away your homework. It just gives you options.
Thank you, Dawn. All right, any other questions? Oh, they're all coming after me.
I couldn't pass up the opportunity. I'm Naomi Noble. I'm the Associate Director of the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment at FDA, and your official FDA liaison for the Rare Disease COA Consortium. I would gently suggest that Michelle Campbell is our unofficial other FDA liaison. You didn't need any more hats, Michelle, it's true. I just wanted to express to you and to the group here as well, just what an extraordinary achievement this is, to finally launch this resource. And as I think Dawn so nicely pointed out, as Michelle did as well, it's a starting point. It's a starting point for a conversation. But the efficiencies that you've created here for this resource to make it no cost to everyone who wants to access it, I think is just an enormous contribution to the whole of the rare disease space. And so huge kudos to you, and Barb, huge kudos to you as well for so much of the behind the scenes work in the day-to-day, which is not always terribly rewarding, but really important all the same.
Yes.
And to just, as well, the broader work that we're doing. So many of our gene therapy endpoint group members are here too, and with our qualitative working group too, I think the whole of the consortium is really working to elevate, ideally, the knowledge base about how to use and implement COAs in the rare disease space, so well done.
Thank you. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know Barb, say hi to Barb. She's my senior project manager for my consortium. She's actually the one who's honestly single-handedly responsible for getting the website developed and working with our sometimes ornery web developers. So she deserves a huge round of applause.